Osio Nagata, welcome to another episode of The Frontlines Are Everywhere. And we're really fortunate today to have a special guest, Cúagilákv, Jess Housty. And just to give a little background on Jess, Jess is from Heiltsuk Nation in Bella Bella, is a poet, writer, social and grassroots activist, founding director of the Haítų Memorial Library. They live and work in their unceded ancestral homelands where they focus on their practices on community building, food sovereignty, indigenous culture, and language resurgence. Jess serves their community and region as executive director of Cox Project Society and lead at Coastal Foodways, and supports decolonial philanthropy as a co-lead of Right Relations Collaborative. Jess is the author of the debut poetry collection Crushed Wild Mint, which came out through Nightwood Editions in October 2023. Jess was also the inaugural recipient of the 2013 UVic Provost Advocacy and Activism Award and received the Indigenous Community Alumni Award from UVic in 2024. They are inspired and guided by relationships with their homelands, their extended family, their non-human kin, and they are committed to raising their children in a similar framework of kinship and land love. So welcome, Jess. And would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
I mean, that was such a beautifully generous introduction. I think the only thing that I would add is that I'm grateful to be speaking to you, not just from my home territory, but out on the land in my home territory. I'm in the Quay watershed, about 55 kilometers south of the Heiltsuk community of Bella Bella, in a land-based facility that my organization runs to bring youth and families out into the territory. So coming to you via solar-powered satellite internet that I hope holds up okay for an audio connection.
Amazing. And how's it been going this week with the land-based programming?
It has been so beautiful. So one of the things that I get to do every spring is I co-teach a UVic geography field school here in Quay, alongside my friend and brother, Dr. Chris Dermott from UVic geography. And this is our last full day of a field class with 20 students out on the land here with us. And of course, that's very focused on Indigenous values, leading science work, and how folks coming into our territories can do their work in a good way that is driven by reciprocity and right relations.
Amazing. And I know you've talked to me before about kind of your approach to, what settler solidarity might look like. And I think you mentioned it as that internship model. Can you talk about that a little bit? In terms of your approach to, how people can act in a good way as, I hesitate to use the word allies, but as folks in good solidarity.
Yeah, I don't love the word ally. I think that one of the things that is important for me to center is that there's very often this attitude, even amongst very well-meaning, values-aligned settler folks, that their simple act of wanting to be in solidarity, of wanting to come into our communities and work with us, is somehow this noble, praiseworthy thing that holds them above accountability for mistakes they might make or challenges that they might face, ways that they might show up incorrectly. And I think that there has to be this recognition that I'm not sitting here swimming in gratitude that settler folks are gaining to come into my territory to work with me. I am here in a position of power and responsibility in my own territory, looking for people who want to share power and share responsibility with me. And in order to do that, there has to be deep trust and deep relationships that take time to build. There has to be a recognition that our people and the knowledge systems that they hold and the ways that they live in their lands and the ways they carry each other in community those are all sources of immense power that folks need to be invited into and earn the trust to be part of. So I think, thinking about it like an internship or like a thing that you have to ladder up into a real meaningful trust-based relationship is so important. You can't just parachute into a community and expect everybody to just be so grateful that you're here that they'll overlook all of the ways that you might be inadvertently doing harm or, not being accountable in the way that you should be. There has to be a recognition that the power has to be shared.
And it's almost, there has to be a process, right, to develop that trust. So shadowing, of course, with permission, and being silent and listening, taking it all in, and then taking direction. Yeah. So wonderful. Well, this is kind of a big question, like a big picture question, but we've been kind of playing around with the idea of Indigenous internationalism and kind of building on Leanne Simpson's work, that as Indigenous peoples, we're inherently international. And, we think about how Indigenous nations across Turtle Island have extensive trade networks, we have kinship networks, we have activism that is all has a kind of an international character to it. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on what Indigenous internationalism might look like from your standpoint.
I mean, I think it's a beautiful thing, and it's so inherent in the way that we show up in relation to each other. And I think that it's so important to frame our power and responsibility as Indigenous peoples in relation to one another instead of all of us being in relation to white Western society. The class that I'm teaching right now, we are inviting a lot of non-Heiltsuk people into our territory to learn from our knowledge holders, to learn on the land, to be here in our territory. Some of the students are Indigenous. The Indigenous students are not Heiltsuk. And so it's still, more than 20 people coming into the territory. And I think that there is a really clear recognition here that, you want those connections, you want those relationships, but they have to be boundaried. And so in the context of this class is assessed and permitted by the Stewardship Office of my nation. And they have really clear guidelines that they put in place to make sure that Chris and I run this class in a good way that aligns with their values and their practices on the land. And so that's the first step in making sure that our relations, both with settler students and with other Indigenous students, are good, that there are boundaries that ensure that they're interacting with our community members, our knowledge holders, our lands, our waters in an appropriate way. And then in the context of the class, I think a lot about what my responsibility is to be a good host. I had grandparents who were very focused on the importance of being a good host to people, regardless of where they are coming from. I want to make sure that all of the students coming out here on my territory with me feel very well hosted, very well taken care of, that they are being set up with the tools and the frameworks and the values and the teachings that they need to be here and feel good and to do good while they're here. Because when they leave, I want them to speak well of Heiltsuk territory. I want them to speak well of Heiltsuk people. Because when they're out in the world and they're doing that and they're carrying that message forward, they are witnessing us and they're upholding us in our power and our relationships in a way that uplifts us in the wider world and positions us as, people of power within our own territories. And so, as I'm inviting lots of people right now into my territory and guiding them out on the land, I want to be a good host and I want to make sure that when they leave, they speak well. And when they speak well, that centers us as people of power in our territory. I feel the same way when I'm visiting other territories, that I have this responsibility to bear witness to the power of the people who are hosting me. And that when I am out in the world, I say, yeah, I was on Haítų. I was in Haítų and they treated me like royalty. They are good people. They are values-driven people. They are people who guided me well so that I could be in good relationship with their lands and their people when I was there. And I left richer for being with them and witnessing the way that they uphold their own relationships and their own power in their territory. And so it is my job now, because I went there and I was so well hosted by them. It is my job to affirm that in the world. And I think that really beautiful things happen when we witness each other that way. I've over the years grown to care very little about how we are witnessed and affirmed by colonial governments, for example, who might, negotiate a treaty or sign off on an agreement. I care a lot more about how my relatives from other nations witness and affirm me and ask me to witness and affirm them, so that we are all upholding each other in our relationships in the world.
Yeah, that's such a powerful way of thinking about it. And I often think I'm kind of the Cherokee ambassador in this area, right? I'm on someone else's territory. I'm on Lekwungen and Wasanich territory. And so I have a special obligation to behave accordingly, but also I love the idea of witnessing the strength and the power of these indigenous nations acting in their self-determining authority. So thank you for that. This kind of goes to, some of your activism work. I mean, you've got so many different projects and so many different ways that you've shown leadership over the years, but who are some of the people that you look up to that you've, that you might say have mentored you or have been influential in the way you think about even, activism, but also just leadership?
Yeah, I have to give a lot of gratitude and credit to my maternal grandparents, George and Becky Housty. Both of them have passed away now, but both were a huge part of my life, very formative part of my life growing up. From my late grandpa George, I learned very clearly that your integrity, it has to be unimpeachable. I remember when I was first taking on a leadership role in my community, he sat me down and he told me that everything that you do, you have to act and speak as though you are holding an eagle feather in your hand the entire time. Like that, you have to act and you have to speak as though you are accountable to something higher, something sacred, all of the time. And if you are acting in a way that you would be ashamed to be holding something sacred in your hand, you shouldn't be doing it. And for him, it was so black and white. You act with integrity or you get out of the way. And that has definitely built a really strong justice orientation in me that I know has been at the base of a lot of my leadership and activism work. I also give a lot of credit to my grandmother, Peggy, who was an unbelievably kind woman. And at this point in my life, I'm not sure that everyone in the world deserves kindness. I want to believe that everyone does, but I also think that if you are kind to literally everyone, that you're doing a disservice to people who are suffering harm. I think that you need to be thoughtful about that. You can't just be uncritically kind to literally everyone. And I think that that was something that I didn't necessarily recognize super clearly when I was a kid and growing up with her. But, reflecting back now, I can see that she had this incredibly gentle spirit, this incredible generosity, where she could always see what it was people around her needed. And she always tried to find a way to rise up and meet their needs and support them and uplift them and feed them and nourish them and care for them. But there was always a line. There was a point at which if you were not being accountable, if you were not reciprocating, if you were not showing up in a good way, she would find gentle but firm ways to hold you to account. And I think that's a balance that I'm always seeking in my life, of how to be as kind as I possibly can, to nourish people as much as I possibly can, to be as generous as I possibly can, but also to know where my line is, where I need you to be here. I need you to rise up and be good, be in right relationship, to try to show up in a good way. You don't have to be perfect, but I need to know that you are self-critical, you are trying not to do harm, you are trying to heal. And if those things are true, then I will absolutely be here to do everything I can to uplift you. And I think that's a tough balance, and a tough balance for me as someone who really wants to give everything to everyone so that everyone can feel better or have more through my own sacrifice. Like, that's just a thing that gives me a sense of purpose. But I think that boundless generosity, or generosity without any boundaries at all, is not a healthy thing. And so I think that's an important teaching that I'm still unpacking from her, but that I'm really grateful for.
Yeah, such a powerful teaching. Yeah, I could really relate to that too, in terms of, I think our strength and our almost our wealth is generosity. But if that generosity is accepted poorly or mistreated, right, then we have some problems, right?
Yeah.
So, well, you and I have known each other for quite some time, and I've seen you in so many different leadership roles. I've seen you over the years on the front lines with Enbridge. I remember talking about banning bear trophy hunting in the Great Barren Rainforest. And then, there was that devastating spill in 2016, the Nathan E. Stewart oil spill, where Kirby Offshore Marine Corporation spilled 110,000 liters of heavy oils and diesel in Heiltsuk fishing waters. And during that spill, you were named incident commander for the tribal council, and as part of the spill response. Can you give us kind of a sense of, that was such a crisis point, right, for Heiltsuk people, and such a devastating impact on not only fishing but on the coastal relationship. What have you learned from those experiences, and in what ways is that legacy still kind of hanging out there? From my understanding, the corporation hasn't really owned up to what they've done or made reparations. So I was wondering if you could speak to that. Sorry to bring it up as it's probably a painful reminder of what's happened, but I wanted to get your sense of that.
Yeah. I mean, there have been so many heavy things over the years, and sometimes it has felt like my whole life has been about reacting to colonial harm instead of living in the Heiltsuk joy and liberation that I would much rather be rooted in. I think, on a personal level, my biggest learning from the Nathan E. Stewart oil spill was that I cannot root my activism and my leadership in anger. The emergency phase of that spill response was 40 days. For 40 days, I was one of the primary people on behalf of the nation who was showing up every day for 12, 15, 18-hour days to govern the response to the incident. And I was angry. I was deeply angry. We were a community that had been fighting tankers and pipelines for years at that point. We knew exactly what was at stake if oil was spilled in coastal waters. We had advocated so hard to prevent something like this from happening. And in spite of everything we had done, it was unfolding in our own territory, and in this beautiful, abundant part of our territory that we had such a special relationship to. And it was so easy to be angry in those early days. And, when I think about what characterized my time, it was anger. But you can't be angry for 40 days and not feel anything else. You can't sustain yourself in the work that you have to do, or at least I can't sustain myself in the work that I have to do if anger is the only place that I'm coming from. And I do believe that rage is sacred, that it has a place, and that it absolutely pushed me to show up as the kind of leader I needed to be in certain moments in that spill response. But I also know that for my own sake and my own well-being, I had to dig really deep and show up every day knowing that I was responding from a place of deep love. That at the end of the day, I was showing up because I love my people, and I love my lands and waters, and I love my non-human kin, and that everything that I was doing was for them. Not just because I was angry. I mean, I was angry, but also because I felt a deep and profound and sustaining love for those things. And that had to be the place that I was coming from, so that I was well enough to keep doing that work for as long as I had to do it, to show up in the way that I was being asked by my community. And it's frustrating, that was such an exhausting and traumatizing time. I struggled in the aftermath deeply with my mental health. I was diagnosed with PTSD. I was bitterly depressed about what I perceived to be my failure to intervene. I had this feeling that, my ancestors had taken care of this place for tens of thousands of years, I did feel like I had done everything that I could to try to prevent something like this from happening. But at the same time, I had this sense that it got screwed up on my watch, that I was one of the people who was responsible for caretaking of our territory and our non-human kin. And while under my watch, this devastating thing had happened, and how could I possibly forgive myself for not finding a way to prevent it or mitigate it? And it's irrational, right? Like, there was nothing that I could have done to stop this. I fought so hard to advocate against things like this happening. I did everything I could for those 40 days to try to mitigate what was unfolding in the territory. But on some really deep spiritual level, I felt like I had let down my ancestors, and I felt like I had let down my lands and my waters and my relatives in that place. And that's a really hard thing to come back from, to feel that you are still worthy of leadership work, that you're still worthy of advocacy work and stewardship work, even in the face of a failure to protect something sacred like that. And that was a really big struggle for me that took a really long time to work my way through. And in many ways, I still haven't worked my way all the way through it. Those are really deep and profound things to have to grapple with as a very imperfect person who was feeling a lot of feelings in the aftermath of that event. And on the other side of it, we had hundreds of people who came from outside the community into Bella Bella to fulfill different aspects of the still response over that 40-day emergency phase. Hundreds of people from different government ministries and from the polluter and from different contractors and companies. And at a certain point, they all left. And we were left in our territory watching all of these people depart, knowing that for them, there was an endpoint. They had checked their boxes, they had done the things they needed to do, and they were leaving. And they could leave. They could go somewhere else. Their sacred place hadn't been polluted. Their home wasn't ruined. Their relationships weren't impacted in a way that they had to grapple with deeply. They all got to check out. And I think that has been really characteristic of how all of those outside agencies who were involved in the spill response, from the polluter to different levels of government, I think it's very characteristic of how they approached it. Was for them, it was a 9-to-5 thing that they came in to deal with. And at a certain point, they felt like they'd done enough and they could leave. It's like, I wish I could check out of feeling the things that I feel about this. I wish that for me there had been an endpoint. But I looked around me in the aftermath of that emergency phase and saw nothing but hurt and fear and trauma and anger in the community that we were left to grapple with when everyone else was gone. And I do not feel like there has been appropriate accountability from colonial governments or from the polluter for their actions that created the conditions for this spill to happen in the first place, or for the spill itself, or for the mistakes made in the aftermath of the spill and during the emergency phase. There's not been appropriate accountability. And our relationship with that place is changed forever. That is a place that is healing. And it's going to take a long time to heal. It's probably going to take generations to heal. And there's work that we have to do to help that healing. But we're doing it alone. And we're not the ones who caused the problem. And I think that is just such a challenging thing for me to know that our relationship to that important place has been so violently interrupted by people who can just walk away from the harm that they caused with no lasting repercussions. And I don't know what the resolution is to that, except that, again, if I spent all my time responding from a place of anger, I would never have the well of love that enables me to continue going to that place, to support its healing, to be in a relationship to it, to fight for it, to speak well of it, to pray for it, to bring my good energy to that place, to try to help it heal. I can only do that because I love it, not because I'm fully angry about what happened there.
Yeah, really powerful. Thank you for that. And I was thinking, there's, and I liked what you said too about rage being sacred. There's a role for emotions in activism that we often don't talk about. And there's love, but there's also rage and these other feelings that come into it. And all of those play such a big role in even how we approach this. I think the other side of it too is, the convenience of leaving a situation, like you said, and not having that full accountability. You've checked those boxes, and it seems to me like the colonial forces that created that spill are still just checking boxes. They're not actually addressing the deeper issue. All right. This is kind of related to the previous question. Is it's often been said that what happens on the land and the water also happens to indigenous bodies, and so I was wondering if you could speak to kind of the notion of body sovereignty, the ways that the ways that we live and the ways that we express ourselves is linked so inherently to land and water, and how, in this case, is an oil spill that was devastating to health and well-being of Heiltsuk people, but there's also the other sides of food sovereignty and other ways that health and well-being can be nurtured and made abundant. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think there's so many dimensions to that idea. I think at the most core level, if you accept that the land is a relative, if you accept that the waters are a relative, when they are harmed, you feel it in the same way that you would if it happened to your parent or your child. That is a real, tangible relationship. And in that instance, for me, there was trauma to the lands and waters. And because I was in deep relationship to the lands and waters, and because I was involved in responding to that trauma that happened, there was also trauma in me, in my body, in my mind, in my heart, that I carried with me for a long time after the incident had happened. And I've thought a lot about the timescales for healing and who gets to decide what the indicators of healing are. And I don't have clear answers, but I think that when harm like this happens at this scale, it affects you permanently. You might heal from the ways that the trauma expresses itself and impacts your day-to-day life, but it's changed you on a fundamental level, and you will never be the same as you were before. Even if the ecological impacts of the spill heal in that place is forever spiritually changed by what happened there. And even though I have learned to manage and work through my PTSD and my trauma that arose from my involvement with the spill response, I'm a fundamentally different person because I experienced that trauma. And there's no amount of healing that's going to make me the person that I was before. And so, because that was a really deep, authentic relationship for me, my body and that place, you can't separate the two in terms of impacts, in terms of trauma, in terms of potential for healing and timescales of healing. And I'm just one person who is in a relationship to that place. So imagine if you have several thousand Heiltsuk people who have a deep relationship to that place, who are all having to look at their own healing journeys in relationship to that. And yeah, I think that there's just something so deeply beautiful about what happens when we're able to support mutual thriving as well. When I need healing, when I'm suffering acutely, when I'm, in a dark place or going through a difficult time, I want to be on the land. I want to be on the waters because I can feel them lift the heaviness from me. And sometimes when I am out on the lands and waters, I feel a heaviness there that I feel like I have the power to lift from the land, to lift from the waters. That's a really deep reciprocal mutual healing and thriving. And when I am out on the land and I am experiencing joy and I'm experiencing liberation, I am able to show up as the person that I am in all my imperfections, with all of my my chaos and my complications and my nuances, but I can just be who I am in that place and feel loved by the land and loved by the waters for who I am, and to want them right back. That roots me in so much deep joy that gives me the power to do what I do in all the difficult moments when I'm just, stuck at a desk looking at a computer or doing sort of advocacy and activism works that are about being in boardrooms and courtrooms and on the streets in the city. I can only do that because the land makes my body well, and because my body is invested in working for the land to make the land well too. And I don't see how you separate the two. I mean, land sovereignty, body sovereignty. My body is the land, and my body is for the land, and it's from the land, and they're just not possible to pull apart.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. I was just back home recently in Oklahoma and just having that same feeling of rejuvenation, right? Just being on our territory, and how you remember things or you think of things differently when you're on the land or on the water, right, than when you're in a boardroom or when you're in a classroom. So, wonderful. You've done a lot of work on promoting Indigenous food sovereignty and food security in your community. And I was wondering how if you could speak to some of the work that you've done, but also kind of how that work is being shared intergenerationally. So how that's being passed on to future generations.
I think that for me, my work in food sovereignty became specific in the aftermath of the spill. I grew up eating lots of ancestral foods and so shaping my life around the cycles of different foods being available. But for me, when the spill happened, there were dozens of marine and intertidal species that we relied on for sustenance that were suddenly taken away, impacted by the spill. And in this particular place in the territory that people call the breadbasket of our nation, it's a place that most families in the community relied on to harvest ancestral foods that were a huge part of their diet. And there was we can talk about like the gifts of anger. Sometimes anger can be an incredible gift. But I remember in the immediate aftermath of the spill, we were holding a community meeting where we were reporting out on what was happening and the impacts that we were seeing, what we were doing about them. There was an elder in the community who became very angry and lashed out at me in particular because I was sort of the face of the response at that point in time. And I was really hurt because I felt like I was doing everything that I possibly could to try to mitigate what was going on. He was so bitterly angry. And it took a couple of days, but I came across him in the street and he asked if we could talk. And he told me that he wanted to be accountable for his anger. He wanted to be accountable for what he had said to me. And what he needed me to understand was that he had grown up in poverty, what he would call poverty by Western standards. And he'd been taken away to residential school. He had been starved at residential school. He had been subjected to dietary experiments. And when he had been able to come home, his family was economically oppressed as a colonization. And for him, the one thing that he'd been able to trust in his life was that the land would provide for him. If there was nothing else that could sustain him, he had enough teachings to know that if he went out on the land would provide the sustenance that he needed to survive. And he'd been able to trust that one thing through all of the violent colonial harms he experienced in his life. And he was feeling deeply destabilized by the fact that he could no longer trust the land to take care of him. He felt like he could no longer trust the lands and waters to sustain him in the way that he had trusted them for his entire life through all the difficulties that he had experienced. And because he was coming from that really destabilized place and that really traumatized place, he was feeling really big feelings. He was feeling really deep anger. And he wanted me to know that that anger was not about me or what I was doing, but it was about that sense of broken trust or broken ability to rely on what nourishes him. And I know a lot of people who were experiencing that. That was the place they were coming from in the aftermath of the spill. And I knew for myself that I could come out the other side of the emergency phase deeply traumatized and really struggling to show up in my day-to-day work and feel good about what I was doing. And I knew that we couldn't replace these dozens of marine and intertidal foods that have been impacted by the spill. But I needed to do something. I needed to do something that felt like it was having a linear impact. And so we started a community garden. And the reason we started a community garden was because we wanted something as simple as being able to say, I'm going to go out, I'm going to put my hands in the dirt, I'm going to plant a seed, and I'm going to nourish the plant. And when there is something to harvest, I am going to give it to someone who needs it, and they will be fed. Like, I needed that simple a chain of reactions to the work that I was doing. I couldn't sit in something cerebral or long-term or vague and undefined. I needed to be planting a seed and growing food and feeding somebody. I had to break it down to that really simple level of just like, what kind of labor can my body do to make sure that people around me are fed? And giving that rhythm back to my life is honestly what saved me from the dark place that I was in the aftermath of the spill. And a lot of people in the community became very involved in food production, wanting to grow food, because it was a thing that gave us a sense of agency over our food security at a time when we were feeling really destabilized. And then, a few years went by, and when the pandemic began to impact our community, it really eliminated the precarity of the freight systems and shipping systems that get things into my community. And people felt that precarity, and they felt destabilized by the precarity, and felt this really deep urge to figure out how we could localize our food economy and be more present with our food systems. And so since then, the work has exploded, and it is happening across the community. People are so focused on local food production at a household level, at a community level. They are wanting to revitalize ancestral foods that we haven't customarily eaten in recent generations. People are wanting to ensure that we have good streams of data coming into the community to ensure that our harvests are sustainable. They want these teachings to be passed down, and so they are intergenerational programs that are happening. People are excited, for example, about seal meat. There are very few families in the community who still eat seal, but we've started hiring hunters to go out and harvest seals and bring them into the community so that we can teach people how to butcher them, and then have workshops on things that you can do with seal meat, ways that you can process it and preserve it, so that those teachings are coming back into the community through multi-generational programs. And what we're rebuilding is intimacy with our food systems. And through that intimacy with our food systems, we are becoming more grounded and more sustainable and more resilient in the way that we live our lives in our territory, more aligned with our ancestral values, and able to exercise a greater degree of autonomy and control over how we feed ourselves and how we thrive. It's long work. Like, it is not work that you can snap your fingers and things change overnight. But I think there's been incredible momentum building. And I see the really deep curiosity that young people have in the community, and the really deep pride that elders have that they can reach back and find those teachings and that knowledge, and that people are ready to hear it and ready to live it again. And it's just so heartening and so inspiring to watch it all build together in a community full of people who are really excited to not just be food secure, but be food sovereign.
That sounds so incredible. And I imagine, you looking at, kind of the next generations trying seal meat for the first time is so heartening, right? Whether it's your own family or other kids that are part of Heiltsuk. Is there a link to language in some of these programs as well? So what's the interrelationship with language revitalization as well and health?
Yeah, there is such beautiful language work happening in my community. Language is being taught K-12 in our community school. We have adult immersion classes that are graduating cohorts of language speakers. We have language nests. So like right almost from birth, kids are able to be exposed to Haíṭuk language as the primary thing that they're hearing when we're at these language nests. And because we have so many graduates coming out of the adult immersion programs, they are then able to embed themselves in different organizations in the community to really center language work wherever they are. So it's not just that we have a language sector in the community that is doing siloed work. We have resurgent language speakers who are spreading themselves out throughout the community and leveling up every institution and every space in the community to ground its work in language. And so, for example, at PEX, we have an incredible young woman, Jess H, graduated the language program, and her role at our organization is to do language-based wellness programming. And so she does retreats in the community and out on the land that are focused on movement and breath and grounding and being well in your body and in your mind and in your heart. And all of it is through a Heiltsuk lens. All of her affirmations, all of her guidance, all of her routines, everything is Heiltsuk immersion. And there are people like that in every sector, which is just so amazing. Like, you're not just a siloed language speaker or language teacher. You are a person who can do that work in the spaces that you care deeply about. And so the more that we can incorporate Heiltsuk language into, our work in revitalizing food systems or in education or storytelling or writing or health, like, there is just Heiltsuk language appearing more and more everywhere. And when that happens, it really shifts the vibe. Our language operates in a different way from English. It is relational. It links us to the work that we're doing and to one another and to our own history and ancestors and ways of being and customs and practices in a very different way. English feels functional, but Heiltsuk is spiritual. And so suddenly everything that you're doing is elevated. Everything that you're doing is more relational and more grounded because you're tying into generations forward and generations back in a way that just doesn't happen when you're chatting in English about the things you're growing in the garden or the deer that you're butchering or, the plants that you're planting.
Yeah. Wow. What for sharing that. Yeah. Thinking about English is functional and Heiltsuk is spiritual is such a powerful way of expressing it. I think, this is kind of a broader question, but you've answered this in different ways. So you can do whatever you want with this question. But, when thinking about the front lines of Indigenous resurgence, oftentimes we look to, front lines as, let's say a protest or a blockade. But we can think of front lines as being in the home. We can think of front lines as being right out on the water. So what do the front lines look like for you in terms of resurgence and resistance? And I know that's kind of a big question, but...
Yeah, I mean, to me, front lines are about the protection of what is sacred. And if I believe, and I do, that my body is inseparable from my territory, if I believe that my land is a relative and that my non-human kin are relatives that I have obligations to, that everywhere that my body is a front line. Everywhere that I am is a space in which I can defend what is sacred and protect what is sacred and be a good relative to my relatives. And I've been on the very clear, obvious front lines. I have been at the protests, I've been at the blockades, and those are beautiful, important, sacred places. Not everyone can be in those places, for accessibility reasons, for parenting reasons, for all kinds of reasons. Not everybody can be on the physical front line of a protest or a fight. And so I think it is really important to uplift the idea that everywhere your body is, if you are in relationship with what you care about, everywhere that your body is a front line. And I think that gives a lot of dignity and a lot of power to people who might feel that they are lacking because they can't be on the political front lines, they can't be at the protests. It is revolutionary and it is liberatory to be the person who cooks the meals, to be the person who watches the kids, to be the person who's out on the land, pulling salmon from the river or picking berries, to be the person who nourishes, the person who caretakes. All of those things are necessary. All of those things are deeply critical to our collective thriving and our collective ability to protect what is sacred to us. And so I think that it is so deeply important that we understand that front lines are us. It's us. We're the front lines.
How has your poetry been received by folks in community, but also outside of community?
One of the stuff that's been so humbling and beautiful. The first event that I had was in the big house in Bella Bella, and my favorite part was that a bunch of the kids who participate in our land-based programs had somehow got copies of my book. I think even before I had copies. And they participated in the reading. They picked their favorite poems.
Wow.
Some of them got up and read, which was honestly, I'll probably cry if I talk about it more.
Wow.
But definitely feel very loved by my community, which just is really special because I had a really deep anxiety. I think that when you do things like this, you feel like you're an ambassador for your people, whether you feel qualified to do so or not. And so I'm deeply grateful for the affirmation that books are what I'm proud. And it's been vulnerable wider world, honestly. It's such deeply personal writing.
Yeah.
That I have to take lots of big, deep breaths when I'm sharing it out in the world. How about if I read You Are Inseparable?
Perfect.
Okay. You are inseparable. Carry it with you. The dirt of your motherland, unapologetic beneath your nails. The splinters and thorns that work medicine under your skin. This is the land striving to give you a sovereign ground within your body. You are a whole territory containing king tides and contour lines and scars that curl like moss, like rivers. Your body is a government. Carry it with you. There are flocks of songbirds sleeping in your hair, deer's wisdom compacted in your heels, salmon in the creeks of your veins. Your body and the land have collaborated for your safety and joy, for your weightless autonomy. And it is your sacred responsibility to thrive within the mutual laws they've written.
Wonderful. Well, I don't know how to follow that up other than to say thank you, Wado. Thank you so much. And we're so grateful for the time that you took today, knowing that this is the last day of the field school. And I don't know if there's anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to say or mention, other than your collection of poetry is available, I think, online. Yeah. And in bookstores. Yeah. So.
Yeah, love to encourage people to pick it up at Iron Dog Books or Massey Books, two beautiful Indigenous owned bookstores in Vancouver that also ship. But all I would add is deep gratitude to you for inviting me into this space and for always sparking such interesting, generous, and generative conversation. Jessica.
Excellent. Wado, thank you, Jess. All right. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Really, I don't know, your words really resonate. And your powerful work is just inspiring.